Our most recent survey of AI use said about 80% of executives are engaging in AI in some way, shape, or form. 80% of those say they are not seeing any value creation coming out of it.
Today's guest is Celia Huber, a senior partner at McKinsey Company, who leads McKinsey's board services work in North America.
I think that boards often ignore the risk of inaction. They're waiting, and not in a pragmatic follower kind of way, but in a, we'll figure this out over the next year or two, and then we'll get at it. I don't think there's that kind of tone.
After 33 years advising some of the continent's most powerful boards, she's here to talk about what boards are getting wrong on AI and shares her hard-won advice on what actually makes boards more effective.
I think particularly people have been talking about having an AI agent in the boardroom. So listening to the board conversation, doing minutes, asking its own questions. That I think is an absolute no-no.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Celia, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Thank you, Ollie. It's so nice to be here.
Celia, you are exposed to a wide range of leading organizations in the Bay Area and across North America. Really interested to hear how you paint the picture of the different ways you're seeing boards engage with AI at the moment and what lessons that offers a board member listening who hasn't got your breadth of exposure.
Yeah, great. Ollie, I see boards are all over the map. So maybe let me paint the picture of the two endpoints I see, and then people are all along that spectrum. At one endpoint, we've got a board who asks, hey, are we managing AI risk appropriately? And at the other endpoint, we've got a board that's super excited that says, are we positioning the company to win using AI? And interestingly enough, both really matter. Only one creates a competitive advantage, right? How do we use AI to get opportunities for the company? But I would say for any board member then listening, my advice would be to anchor in value. What's the opportunity for us? Force clarity on the AI posture. And I think we'll talk a little bit about AI posture archetypes that the company is pursuing. So are you looking more for productivity? Or are you actually trying to create a new business? That means not getting stuck in pilots. You got to balance the risk that we talk about versus that ambition of the opportunity. And I think board members should be engaged and think of themselves as a co-architect with the management team for the company's AI future. And so I'm going to talk a lot about strategy in my boardrooms and how AI fits in with that strategy, but you can't ignore the risks that it presents as well.
Okay, now you talked about not getting stuck in pilots. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yes. So a lot of companies really focus in on what are the use cases. And I found, because AI is so important to the future, every business leader, every functional leader wants their own use case. And so often we fall into a trap of, instead of going deep in some areas where the value pools really are, we let everyone have a use case. And so I've got 1,000 flowers blooming. By the way, I may not have all the technical talent to support those 1,000 flowers. And so what ends up happening is I don't do any really well. I don't end up with a whole field of flowers. I end up with spending a lot of time, energy, frustration, and I usually only end up with one or two things working. So what I would propose instead is a real focus on what are the one or two value pools we're going to go after first. What does that really mean? Those value pools could be and are likely to be not a single use case, but rather a whole function or a whole business process. And as a result, that might mean one business leader gets to go first while others have to wait, and then deploy the technical talent against that in a more focused way.
Can you bring to life for a listener what you mean by a value pool, or perhaps even an example of one?
Yeah, sure. So I work in insurance. So let me give you an insurance example. Hopefully insurance is exciting to me. Hopefully it'll be exciting to our listeners. So, okay, example of a global insurer. One of the things that they obviously do is process claims, right? And so they want to roll out both generative AI and agentic AI in their claims processing. So claims are already automated today. About 80-85%, depending on the type of insurance, have automated claims. So this is not about going from human to automated. It's about going from automated to even more automated and better quality outcomes. So they started, when I talked then about the value pool versus a pilot could be, hey, I just want to take claims that are related to auto accidents in Georgia. Okay. And I'm going to pilot it there. Maybe there's some unusual things about Georgia, like they don't have snow. And so there are a whole set of accidents that don't happen. So as a result, I've got a pilot. I may be excited about that, but I don't really know if it's scalable. I don't really know if I've taught the AI the broad-based situations that could happen in other parts of the country. And again, it's super US example, so bear with me. If I think about what I would prefer to happen, it would say, okay, look, we're going to do this on claims. We may start with a small set of claims, but I need a pretty robust view of the entire value pool. And I should set what my success metrics look like. So in this particular case, it was to reduce costs by over 15%, but also increase customer satisfaction by 5 points and have stable performance. So if you want, I can just run through how they got through the AI governance and then how the board interacted with that. So the first thing that happens is they've tiered AI use into low, medium, and high risk. Okay. And that then triggers different guardrails because they are doing claims, which has a direct impact on customers. So it's not internal only, it's external facing. Their guardrails are to call that high risk. And that means there's a human in the loop for denials. Okay. So the claim cannot be denied simply by the AI logic. It also means that there has to be bias testing and we have to have audit ability. So we have to have what's called explainability logs so that we know why we approved or denied certain claims. Okay. They then have also guardrails on data and vendors to ensure things like IP protection. So if we have the secret sauce on agentic AI for claims, we don't want to give that away. We also want to have audit rights. We need to have model transparency because insurance is regulated. And because it's regulated, we need to be able to explain to the regulators what's going on. All of that happens by predetermined AI guardrails so that the business can move fast and think about how to get this going without having to go back to the board. And then they only need to go back to the board then if there are escalation triggers like error rates or customer complaints spike. So we started this and it got way out of control. We want to be able to go in front of the board, explain, discuss how we're going to regroup. If there are regulatory risks, of course, we need to inform the board. And then so the board ends up being involved where it matters. They're not debating the guardrails every time someone wants to go do something. So a big enough chunk of the business claims, not a small piece, and then a set of infrastructure that is already developed so that the business leaders can go fast in applying AI.
Got it. So if I play that back, you just articulated that as a big enough piece of the big business, which is the claims area. We want to, and then agreeing the KPIs that you want to shift, and then having those guardrails in place so that the executive understand what the rules of engagement are. How do you go about putting in those guardrails as a board when there's so much unknown territory that you're navigating?
Yeah. So in fact, less than 25%. So we recently ran a survey of board directors. Less than 25% of companies have the kind of structured governance that I've just described. And, what we don't want is a debate in the boardroom every single time. So I would say what I've described is not rocket science. In fact, you don't even need to know how all of the AI works to say, hey, we should be able to audit it. We should be able to have human beings before we deny big claims, right? And so this is a little bit about having the management team come to you with a set of these guardrails and agreeing upon them as a board. There are lots of places to go to for help, right? There are both the NACD in the US or groups of other corporate directors that are working on this. There are also a lot of IT-oriented governance places that are dealing with this. This is not so different than what we were using machine learning for, which is an earlier form of AI. It's just that this is developed quickly, can be used quickly. So we need to be knowledgeable about the guardrails before we get started.
You talked about the best practice boards you're seeing thinking of themselves as co-architects in this. Where do you draw the line? You talked about getting involved in the guardrails. Are there other areas that as a board you should be co-architecting, and where do you stop?
Yes. So I think fundamentally the co-architecting is around alignment on what your strategic posture is towards AI. Okay, so the notion of strategic posture for me is around two dimensions. Okay, one is, are we using AI in a more strategic or a more tactical place? So let me give you an example. Strategic means I've got more new products that are AI enabled, and I'm actually going to enter new businesses because I now have AI. A more, internal posture around, I'm going to functionally improve my operational wiring, okay, internally. So instead of, finance reporting, I'm going to have AI help people query our finance reports. That's going to save a lot of time internally and save me money. So the notion of how strategic versus non-strategic is it? The second is how holistic versus targeted is it? So while we talked about value pools, you could say holistic is really rewiring my whole business, not just a particular area. A targeted might be, hey, I know I spend 80% of my sales and administrative cost in my call center. So my value pool is really the call center. I'm going to be targeted about the call center. I'm not going to worry about other things right now. When you do that, you actually end up with 4 archetypes. So the most strategic, most holistic is we call a business pioneer. So that's really around what's the new growth engine for the business. Again, strategic, but maybe more focused on targeted. You'd say, gosh, those folks are really pragmatic adopters, right? They're going to look at targeted places. They can make strategic investments. Then you've got a whole set of folks that are less strategic, more internally oriented. And a holistic version of that might be a total transformation of the operating model of a company using AI. And a more targeted version might be what I just described in finance. I'm going to take a particular function and take all of those areas and apply AI. And so I think the board should have a conversation with management about what is our positioning relative to those archetypes. Some business units might be mature and more about the cost orientation, and their value pools might be very clear. I want to work on supply chain within this business unit using AI. And some might be, we've got a whole new business that we can offer. We're going to do different diagnostics. We're going to offer different ways to work with our customers. An example might be, hey, you design your own insurance product, right? At a level of customization and personalization that we can't do without AI. Those two things are very different. And I think the board and the management team needs to agree on that a priori. Then the management team should react the same way it does on other strategic issues, right? If I'm using it to create a new business, the management team should stay close to that. If I'm using it to improve, then I would say, what are the metrics? And just report to me on the metrics. Only come back if there's a problem. And so that also has implications, right? Is it in the audit committee or is it the full board or is it a tech committee that's looking at these things?
So for a board member listening, thinking to themselves, Celia, this makes a lot of sense, but how do I as a board member help the executive figure which one of those 4 archetypes we should be sitting in? Have you got examples that you could share that would bring those sorts of discussions to life?
I think companies are only starting to do this now. So I'm working with a company that is more in the pharmaceutical area, and they are working on taking their strategy and putting it into these archetypes just right today. So what I would say is, if I look back a year ago, boards were more having the conversation of AI is interesting. What do we do with it? And today, boards are having the conversation of, I'm worried we're going to fall behind. How are we applying AI? And that's when the archetypes come into play, as opposed to, I don't know that people a year ago were asking that question, at least not in your mainstream companies. Now, I do think that there are tech companies, certainly in Silicon Valley, that were ahead of the curve on this. And you see some of the interesting things that they're doing in terms of rolling out tools. And so they really are creating a whole new business, but it's a tools business that they're rolling out to enterprises.
Okay, but just to help a board member listening think about how might they apply this to their situation. If we take an example of, I don't know, pick a business, I don't know, Fannie Mae. I don't know if that's a bad example, or Apple. You pick a business and just talk me through how a board member on that organization, what are the questions they need to be asking in order to figure out which of those quadrants they should be guiding the exec to focus on in order to identify their sort of highest value pools.
Yeah. So I think first, there are questions about what are the value pools, the value levers. Okay. Typically, the value levers by using AI fall into 5 buckets. Productivity, cost transformation. That was one of my examples. End-to-end process reinvention. So supply chain planning or recruiting could be another good example of that. Third is revenue uplift. So can I have personalization or sales support? So kind of a co-pilot for my salesperson who's going out into the field. Fourth is new products and business models. So those are things like AI-enabled products or tools. And then the last could be risk management, and fraud detection might be a good example, particularly for a bank. If I were to then apply that to a Sallie Mae, which is student lending or mortgages, any kind of lending, right? The productivity cost transformation is more back office. Can I get some of my processes done more quickly? If we said, gee, given regulation, I don't think I can have AI interact directly with the customer on revenue uplift or on new products, then the archetype is pretty clear. It's either a functional reinventor, if I want to do it in a narrow way, or an internal transformer, if I want to do it in a broad-based way. But fundamentally, I'm in that productivity, either targeted or holistic. If now I say, gosh, instead of what I've been offering before, the regulation allows me to offer a totally customized, personalized loan product that allows me, like, let's say I am doing pre-med as my undergrad. So my student loan, I really don't want to have to pay off right away. I want to roll it into then med school loans. And then eventually I'll have a job that pays me real money and I'm going to be able to pay it back. I may want to tweak my loan in a way that's personalized for me. And that may not be a standard product that Sallie Mae offers today. And so how do I think about using that for new products? And then that becomes more of a growth engine of, can I either retain customers, increase my profitability, maybe even increase the number of customers. Student loan, maybe not more people are going to go to school, but maybe more will decide to pursue paths that they require loans for.
Got it. So it sounds like it's a combination of sizing the opportunity in each of those quadrants, but also figuring out if there are any reasons why you can't operate in any of those quadrants is going to leave you by a process of elimination with the area where you should focus first on.
Right. Process of elimination or prioritization might be another way to say it, right? Yeah. I think that's a more articulate way of describing the sort of the longer process. But I think if you have a clear strategy, you know where those value pools already are. And you know, hey, I need to take 10, 20, 30% of my cost base out. And so you're already looking at those levers that would help you do that.
I mean, I think that's a really helpful framework because one of the things we host these masterminds for our Enter the Boardroom community where we bring together board members and we have a dedicated chair mastermind group where we bring chairs of organizations together and they share challenges. One of the challenges I've heard come up a few times now is that the executive aren't engaging in it. And I'm curious to hear if that's something you've come across, or maybe everyone in the Bay Area is already just pre-programmed by DNA to engage in AI. But if you have seen it, what you've seen boards successfully do to navigate that.
Yes, our most recent survey of AI use said about 80% of executives are engaging in AI in some way, shape, or form. 80% of those say they are not seeing any value creation coming out of it. So I think what's happening is folks are experimenting is probably the right word. They're trying to learn, but they're not necessarily taking this systematic approach. So if I were thinking about executives, first of all, not everyone's going to adopt everything right away. And so like any change program, there are probably a set of change leaders that are more enthusiastic about using it in their businesses. I think that that's fine. Again, we don't need to have 1,000 flowers blooming. So if the board members see, a either business unit that is more inclined, both the leader and the type of business that it is, towards using AI, I would push there. I don't think that boards should let their management team be completely silent on AI because, your competitors are likely to be using AI. And before you know it, you don't want to be in a situation where you're competitively disadvantaged and have a year or more of development to be able to catch up. And so I think it's a really important question about how to maintain that balance, but not everyone in the company needs to use AI for you to have the company moving forward strategically on using AI. That being said, I think that all top management teams should at least have a working knowledge of AI. And as a result, we've been doing a lot of education, both of board members and of management teams on AI, and so have others. So we collaborate with MIT, but, I think there are lots of different ways that this can be done. I would like to make sure that they're not choosing to ignore AI because they just don't understand it, Ollie, versus they're making a conscious choice about where AI should be applied versus not.
Most people assume a strong executive career is enough to land a board role. It isn't. Boards prefer candidates with prior non-executive experience, and that creates a catch-22. You can't get experience without a role, and you can't get a role without experience. The Enter the Boardroom community helps you break that cycle. You'll build genuine governance credentials, sharpen your board proposition, and get access to over 2,000 live board opportunities a year. Visit etb.newrole.com to find out more. One of the things that struck me recently as an operator is how quickly things are changing. And the thing I'm sort of starting to think a lot about is how do you get the communication in the organization so that this frontier usage is spreading across the organization, but not becoming noise? Because there's a real risk that you lose the signal from the noise because there are so many different things going on. Really curious to see again how the boards you're working with are navigating that challenge. Is that one they're even alive to yet?
There are so many levels of this question. One is in the boardroom, right? One is with the management team, and then across the entire employee base. And your question was a little bit about the entire employee base, but those other questions are good too. The entire employee base, we know that employees are using AI even outside the boundaries and outside the guardrails of their companies to be more productive in their jobs. So they're experimenting with ChatGPT and Claude to be able to create presentations, memos, sales pitches, and do their job more productively. I think the problem with that is, first of all, the company's not really sure if everything's staying within their firewalls. Secondly, we have people say it just gives you extra time to take the dog for a walk. Like, we're not really harnessing that extra productivity in a way that's systematic. And so while I don't think that that's noise, that might be too negative a connotation for what I'm describing. It's good that people are excited to learn to use AI, but I'd like to see more discussion within the company of, hey, this is how you can use it. Here are the different tools. Here's a support function that helps you. So even within McKinsey, we've got tools that we can use that are enterprise level tools, but we also are writing our own tools because we have our own culture of how we create presentations for clients. And this could be dramatically improving our productivity. For right now, a lot of times that we spend a lot of time on the slides, right? Versus, time that could be better spent elsewhere. And so we are creating our own version that allows it to, employ our guardrails automatically. And so I'd like to see a discussion about where, again, back to the value drivers, where should we be using AI? And then how can the company provide a little bit more support to employees than what's happening today on how to do that?
Curious to hear how you're seeing AI being used by the boards themselves in the boardroom.
That is an interesting question. A bunch of the board platforms, so Diligent is a great example, but BoardVantage have rolled out some AI modules that they're starting to put in place. Many board members have not seen those agents at all because the companies have not turned them on. So those agents can do things like help synthesize, go back and forth across different dates. Just imagine your average board member, I know we discussed this. I remember it maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. What did we say we were doing and what were going to be the metrics of success? And are those the same ones the management team is showing me now? A lot of that material is in the board platform. If the board has been archiving that, the company has been archiving that. But there's no easy way to search and find it. These AI agents can be super helpful in doing that, super helpful about, framing the questions or I have this question and instead of asking management, I'm going to ask the AI agent first. And they're going to say, oh, Celia, you missed that. That's on page 65 of the pre-read. Let me take you there. Right. And so it could be a great tool to have a more sophisticated conversation in the boardroom. However, general counsels, at least in the U.S., are very worried about how that data is being used outside the ecosystem of the company. And so while the board platform is contained, the board members are not often given enterprise level tools to query that board platform that is also contained in the guardrails. So I do see board members trying to use AI outside the ecosystem of the company and the enterprise data kind of guardrails. And they're using them on things that some are fine, like, hey, I'm going to look at all the competitors and synthesize the last earnings calls before I go into my board meeting just so that I can be smart about what's happening. But I think it's a real challenge. And I do think some board members might be using the tools with confidential data outside of what would be accepted by the GC and the company. And so my advice is to have that conversation openly in the boardroom. We'd like to use some of these tools. How can we lay out the guardrails so that we can have access to them?
Interesting. We recorded an episode with Betsy Atkins, who made the point like a sort of absolute no-no to have AI in the board in the US, particularly because it's such a litigious culture, because you lose your privileged position. And suddenly, if you have a record of having asked the quote-unquote stupid question, someone can go back in time and say, hey, look, there you are, you were asking stupid questions. You clearly weren't doing your role properly. Is that a sentiment you're seeing broadly?
Yeah, I think it's a good point from Betsy, and that is what most GCs would say. I think particularly people have been talking about having an AI agent in the boardroom. So listening to the board conversation, doing minutes, asking its own questions. That I think is an absolute no-no. And for all the reasons Betsy described, right? In the US, board minutes are heavily synthesized when done by people. So the board discussed X. It's not, what exactly were the questions. And then the outcome of the discussion was Y, not exactly the ups and downs of the conversation. So let's assume I'm really using it to query the old board materials and synthesize. Then I think that it's more nuanced than what Betsy's describing. And I'd like to think that we could create some guardrails for the agents to use where they're not offering opinions. They're simply pointing you to the materials and or synthesizing those materials for you to make a more productive and effective board member.
You talked about the board members who are using AI outside the guardrails and putting sensitive information. I guess the worst case scenario I came across recently was a founder who asked AI to analyze the strategy of one of its competitors and surface the actual strategy document of a competitor that clearly a board member or someone had put into a sort of free version of the AI. But if someone is using an enterprise level of one of the sort of, big AI platforms, whether that's GPT, Claude, Gemini, or Copilot, or whoever else it is, that has the sort of privacy, we're not training on this data switched on, does that board member have something they still need to be worried about using it in those situations?
I don't see many companies that are giving the board members access to their enterprise versions of AI tools. And I think so let me just start with your premise and then we can go to where I think that the nervousness is. Partially that's because I'm not sure management teams want board members going helter-skelter through the enterprise looking at different data, right? So I think we're still in this dance of what is going to be accessible 24/7 to the board members and what is going to stay inside the enterprise but not accessible to the board members. The board platform, all of that has been accessible to the board members. And so that might be a good place to start versus a truly open enterprise tool that has access to all of the learnings from the company. That being said, there's got to be a discussion about transparency. So what are we worried about that the board members are looking through and how do we adjust access for that? So I think that's one conversation. The point that you're making, which is, okay, assuming that I've got access to that and I'm working within that, then I think that the risk is much lower for the board members. Now, what I wouldn't want to do is keep all the reporting of the board members ask these questions versus thinking about how long those things are archived and, whether the board members can ask questions and have it be either more anonymous or not keep all of the records and for how long. And that I think is a legal question. I do think that there's some sectors that will never go to the level of use and transparency. So the oil and gas sector, they've had a lot of big shareholder lawsuits. I don't think that their GCs are going to feel comfortable with this. I think that there are going to be some tech companies that are going to say, well, this is part of our mission. It's in our products. We can't have the board not using any AI tools. That just is not consistent with the culture that we're trying to create. And what are the guardrails for that?
If a board has just one meeting a year to discuss AI, my guess is you'd say that's already a no-no. But what are the 3 strategic questions it has to answer?
Yep. So I think the three questions I'd start with are pretty consistent with what we've been talking about. One, where is the value in your industry or your business from AI? Two, what should be our strategic posture? Are we doing selective or more holistic adoption? The third one is, how does that relate to our ambition and where are we going to measure success? So what does good look like? And then, alignment along those three questions, you'll end up with alignment on those archetypes that we've been talking about. Are we a business pioneer, an internal transformer, a functional reinventor, or a pragmatic adopter? And so that's what I'd say. If you could get alignment on those three questions, then the management team has a lot that they can work on in between your annual meeting on AI. But again, annually is probably not enough.
Are there examples that jump out at you where you've seen boards getting this badly wrong already?
For sure. So I think that it's not for lack of trying, though, Ollie. I think every board director wants an answer on this question. But I think sometimes it's the wrong mental model. So either a compliance mindset, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning, a compliance mindset versus a more strategic value creation mindset. And I think that boards often ignore the risk of inaction. So we don't know what to do, so we're not going to do anything right away. And they feel like that's the safest course of action, but I would argue that's the worst course of action because the rest of the market, your competitors, they're all moving. Customer expectations are moving. So inaction has its own risks. And that's pretty much the issue that I see with boards who get it wrong is they're waiting, and not in a pragmatic follower kind of way, but in we'll figure this out over the next year or two, and then we'll get at it. And I don't think there's that kind of time.
So for a board or a chair listening to this, who are thinking to themselves, Celia, you have woken us up to this opportunity or terrified us that we are not doing enough. We want to go away and design a 6-month AI learning journey for our board. What do you recommend we do?
So first of all, for board members, I think a commitment that they're going to spend the time. So what I'd love to see is, let's call it 2 to 3 hours a month in a format that allows for a mix of education. By that, I mean, you could have some of those discussions be company specific, like let's really look at one area of value. There could be some external speakers that would come in and really try to lift the group up by showing them new ideas, more leading edge. And there should be some hands-on learning. Again, within the appropriate guardrails of the enterprise solutions that are being used. What I'd love to see is the output of that 6 months is the board has a clear AI posture. Where are we using it? What's the value? A defined governance model. So you could use these learning sessions not just to learn, but actually to make some choices about the governance model. And the third is I would love for them to have visibility into value and risk within AI usage in the company. There are some good programs out there. So what I'm describing is a mix of learning, but also doing and making some decisions along the way so that at the end, the board is aligned on what they're trying to accomplish with AI, not just, hey, I understand the tools.
Celia, we've talked a lot about AI, but I feel it would be criminal for me not to step back because you've spent 33 years studying board effectiveness more broadly at McKinsey and lead the North American board practice. So I'd love to hear from you. If you're introduced to a board for the first time, you don't know anything about the board and I tasked you with improving the board's effectiveness by 20% in 1 year, where would your intuition lead you to focus and why?
Well, I would start with the board agenda, linking the topics and the time that they're spending and seeing if that links to value creation levers for the business. I recently did a look at a board and first of all, they spent hardly any time on some of the value creation, particularly in organic growth. And they spent a lot of time on backward-looking financials, compliance, quality issues. Those things are important, but I think you can learn a lot by looking at a board and where they spend their time. And so if I wanted to improve productivity by 20%, I would start with what's the clear thesis for value creation for that company. I would tune the board agenda to that. And I would move a lot of the compliance work into pre-reading so that it's more of a Q&A session rather than a long discussion in the boardroom.
That feels like there were sort of brilliant McKinsey reports highlighting that sort of 20, 30 years ago as an issue, and yet that's still the case. What's the root cause? Why is this such a difficult thing to tackle when you've got so many smart people around these tables? Why is this still such a problem?
Look, one of the things that has been interesting to me to move from consulting to actually being a board director myself is it's easier said than done. So my own boards have some of these challenges, and it's not that we don't know what to do, right? It's that, first of all, a board culture evolves over time. The management team rightly wants to share some of its biggest successes, what it's been working on with the board. Sadly, the board doesn't need to actually know everything the management team's working on. They need to really focus on the big picture, the stuff that the board is uniquely qualified, either from an oversight or a value-added point of view, to help on. It's hard to do that. It's hard to do that. For example, at one of my last board meetings, the management team had gone through a real, trial and success of a big change with a customer. And they wanted to tell us all about it. And the board was excited to hear all about it. But the reality was that was very backward looking. The question we should have been talking about is, okay, you've done this with one customer. How do we do it with 100? Right. And so I think we're all people, and we fall into wanting to talk about where we are spending our time and what we've done. And we want a pat on the back for that. And that's an important part of the board meeting, but it's not the main part.
Celia, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Great. Let's go for it.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
So right now I'm recommending A CEO for All Seasons. It covers the 4 seasons of a CEO's tenure. It was written by some of my colleagues, but I think what's interesting is where the board can coach someone on each of those seasons.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Oh, not doing the pre-reading.
A question every board should ask at least once a year.
Do we have the right CEO succession plan? Just because we have a new CEO doesn't mean that you don't need a clear CEO succession plan.
Boardroom myth you think needs busting?
That CEOs are always the best board members. Previous CEOs are always the best board members. I have not seen that to be the case. Some are, some aren't.
Favorite quote?
Favorite quote is from Peter Drucker. The first task of the board is to make sure the company has the right strategy.
Piece of board advice that sounds right but is wrong?
That first-year directors should not speak until they learn the ropes. I'm sure you've heard this. And I would say you're there for a reason. Use your judgment and ask for feedback on how you're participating.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time, and how has that changed how you behave?
Well, as we were discussing, it's easier to advise than it is to do. And so I think it's made me more empathetic to the challenges that both CEOs and management teams are facing and that board directors are facing.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
It wasn't that long ago, and I would say don't be distracted by one division's problems to the detriment of another one that could be growing even faster. So in the boardroom, there's some areas that have problems, and you can focus too much on those versus the area that might end up being your growth engine going forward.
And finally, one thing our listeners should take away from this episode, if they take nothing else.
Focus on value creation and that leadership in the boardroom by refocusing the group on value creation.
Celia, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thanks, Ollie.
If your executive track record isn't translating into board traction, you're not doing anything wrong. The game just has different rules. The Enter the Boardroom community gives you the tools, the network, and the structure to start winning it. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.